I think we're live. I'm here with Nick Ross. This is Beard Banter episode 44. This might turn into 45, 46, 47. There's a lot of material here, but we're at least going to start with episode 44. T-Minus365, Nick Ross with Sourcepass. Nick, nice to see you. Glad to have you on the show with me, sans beard or not. But I think the brain is so large, it's warranted an emeritus beard on this show. But why don't you introduce yourself, brother, and kind of tell people who you are?
Yeah, I appreciate it, man, and happy to be on here as well too. I've been watching your episodes and guests as well too. Very impressive. So, yeah, I'm Nick. I'm a VP of product here at Sourcepass, which is an MSP out of Long Island, and I also run T-Minus365, which is a blog and YouTube channel for MSPs related to Microsoft, SMB, those types of things. I am a Microsoft MVP. But I create a lot of content around this ecosystem and just, tying into PSA tools, those types of things. And it's really content that Microsoft doesn't produce because they're really focused on enterprise. But yeah, happy to chat today. Some exciting topics.
Well, and I'll kind of start this by saying for anybody out there, first off, go ahead and comment. We'll post your comments up. We'll chat about them. We'll let them disrupt us and distract me from what I'm thinking at the time. But also, Nick and I met when I was still at Iconic. I was working for an MSP and maybe even a little before that. And he was always that person seeing the vision I saw, which either means we're both delusional, or I at least had a kindred spirit to speak with, right? In the sense that, my vision is that if you were in a world where you were behind an identity provider, whether it be Microsoft, Okta, whoever it may be, and mostly consuming a resource that is SaaS and tied to SAML or OIDC from an extensibility of single sign-on, then I could craft a lot of really cool stuff. In fact, so much so that since 2017, our entire MSP throughout that entire growth period was tied to Azure AD, was bolted into mostly SAML and OIDC extensibilities, had tons of things and protections in place that I could apply. And Nick was that guy that said, hey, we could automate all this. We could make this data visible and valuable. And, so we worked together on some projects there. And that's how we got to know each other. And since then, you've been a font of information. I consume T-Minus365 to save me about 4 hours of reading that you do for me so graciously. So it's fantastic, brother. I'm glad to have you here.
Yeah.
So the reason I wanted to have you here was you sent me a link and asked me to take a look at it. And I figured no better way to look at it than for us to do this live on Beard Banter. So let's go ahead and take a look at it. Anybody in the audience, is anybody already set up very much like what Nick Ross and I talked about? And Nick, if you want to add any words to kind of my vision of what modern workplace kind of looks like as well, while I pull this thing up.
Yeah. No, I mean, you've always been a mentor to me. Like just talking with a lot of MSPs at Pax8 is honestly, how I drew all these ideas as well too, and just seeing different maturity levels, different thought processes. But we all want to move in a positive direction from a security sense. So a lot of my work as well too, from the standpoint of things that I look in from a Microsoft perspective, does relate to either automation or security. Because I believe, automating can give you more time back to serve, for security and those types of things, and just help you scale from a customer perspective as well too, from a customer experience perspective. But largely, I've always been wanting to help from the standpoint of getting acclimated to what is actually available in Microsoft for a lot of people. Because during my time at Pax8, which is almost 6 years, that was a constant conversation about, just the lack of feature adoption, where you get a lot of rich security features that are totally under-adopted. And it's not really, obviously we all know that it's not quote unquote secure by default, right? You have to configure those things, and you also have to update your customers. Like one of the big things that I think that when you talk to larger people, as in like, higher ups in Microsoft, something like that, they always reference, well, we can just turn these things on, and it's not that easy, right? Like we have to have control. We have to educate our customers on the importance, and we have to give a kind of a drip campaign to those changes. Otherwise, you're looking at a lot of pain, from the disruption, those types of things too. So those are always things I like to educate on, because I have more first-hand experience just being closer to Microsoft.
Yeah, and I think I want to add one piece to what you said, because it's actually quite poignant, which is, it leaves more time for security. No. Automation and baselines is security. When you
Sure.
think about it, if you talk about securing your house, me locking my door is part of securing my house. Well, having this set this way is part of securing my security, right, around Microsoft's baselines. And so one of the things that you also said was it's a journey. You have to get there. You have to make ready to a change, get the groups prepared, add the users to it, prepare them for what's about to happen, watch expectations play out, and manage through that as a journey, right? And you get them eventually where they are. So what I love about this is you've written a guide called Microsoft Security Baselines. It's in version 2.0 now, as I can see, and I'll go ahead and share it now. But this guide and this baselines guide basically sets a lot of your vision of the things that should be said of all the field of things that's out there. And also, one of the things you said was it's not secure by default. When you buy a car and drive it home, you do not sit in the driveway and go fumble for the settings for where to turn on the airbag. That's not part of the setup process. It's already done. And I think to your point, most Microsoft tenants come the least secure they're ever going to be the moment you touch them. You're going to improve them. And this gives you a guide for that. So, how's this set up? Tell me about the structure. How should somebody apply this guide, Nick? And then we'll kind of dig into it.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of the inspiration behind this was derived from other projects or material that's been published. Like I really love the Scuba project from CISA that came out probably a year ago now, but it basically allows you to run an assessment against a tenant and has some recommendations across the Microsoft product suite, such as Azure AD or Entra, as it's now known, Teams,
Sure.
OneDrive, SharePoint, those types of things. And CIS has a Microsoft 365 benchmark that a lot of people follow as well too, just to say these are their recommended baselines that they actually map back to CIS controls. So I wanted to kind of expand off of that as well too, because I felt like there was a lot of gaps. And again, there is the concepts of SMB versus enterprise level type of application. And a lot of what I wanted to do in this guide is give or just expand on the enablement content. So it's formatted in the sense of working your way through each particular Microsoft suite offering like Entra and Intune and those types of things. And then within each control, it kind of gives a summary and description of what that particular control is about, gives you the setup instructions. It maps it to CIS control as well too. And then I also include end user notification templates if it's applicable for change control, as well as PowerShell scripts, in addition to any type of video content, whether that's created by me, created by some of the people I follow a lot in the Microsoft ecosystem that I feel like really captures the content really well. So ultimately, it's an enablement guide, and some of the concepts behind it is obviously that it's a guideline. It's not trying to be super prescriptive, but it's tied to CIS, and I love that because we're talking about IG1 through IG3, and it's talking about prioritization. Those types of things that should be foundational, should be a baseline for all of your tenants, and then IG2, IG3, something that you could work towards with your clients as well too, in the sense of more security. So purely just enablement guide.
Very cool. Yeah. And so breaking down that guide as we talk about this, right? You have the very beginning. Let's look at, 2.12 policy. So one of the things that's nice, all devices are periodically reviewed in the Intra ID Admin Center. So you're also giving, it's a new word, just made it up, Nick Ross. That one just rolled off the tongue. But you're also giving a guidance towards that governance component, right? And that policy component that says, how would I even meet this 1.1? Right. Well, all devices are periodically reviewed in the Entra ID Admin Center, and that's saying, hey, if we talk about your data surface back in this magic world I defined in the beginning, where everybody's tied to AAD, everything extends out into the data surface that they use through their application surfaces in single sign-on. Then when you're talking about what devices you're looking at, those would be most of the devices able to actually touch data, right? And when you look at CIS 1.1, it doesn't say collect every single asset. It does say, however, collect assets that, comma space, have the ability to store, process, or touch data, essentially, right? The other component of this that's missing that also has to be added to this is 1.1 is a list. And so while this also can help serve 1.1 in this safeguard, it's a facilitator of that. It's something you might obtain data from. You still have to have a list. And you might say, well, why? I have it in AD. You can't say when the asset was approved. You can't say when the asset was allowed, where it was purchased. You can't meet some of the other columnar needs, right, that you need to have around that data for you to actually meet 1.1 effectively, in my opinion. And so I do think what's great about this, one of the things that I would want to think about as I'm looking at this is, don't think of this as the holistic way to serve 1.1. Think of it as a method to serve it, right? I think you said before we got on air, Nick, it's a lens, right? But it's a big lens. And the more and more you put it in that magic world that I said, the more and more that lens is a really, really, really poignant lens for these asset reviews, right? And anything to add to that on this particular piece?
No, that's spot on. I mean, you're at least getting a good perception about what devices are accessing your network to a certain degree, like in the sense of the Azure space. And the
Sure.
more restrictive you get around it, you can start looking at, compliance policies or conditional access policies around, restricting that further and further. And that ultimately gets really tightened down from the standpoint of like having heavy end user impact, but that's where you're working from IG1 to IG3 in that sense. But you're also getting a good perception on how many personal devices are accessing my data, how many corporate devices do we have enrolled, are they encrypted, with BitLocker, are they meeting our compliance policies and Intune if you have it enrolled, those types of things. And it gives you a good position to say, this is a gap in and of itself of we want to hit to this state if we're going to get there. And for some customers you bring on that, need to follow something more like HIPAA, it has to be a standard because their risk tolerance is a lot lower, in that sense, from that standpoint as well too. So I think it's, again, just a lens, but you're covering a lot of ground, especially like you mentioned earlier with identity. If you can enable a lot of applications for single sign-on and have that identity extend outward versus just the Microsoft ecosystem.
Yeah. Well, and you covered something really important there for people, which is if you think about what is an asset, initially that asset list is all these things touching the data because the rule is still whatever can store, process data. Azure AD is going to capture where are you signing in from? Did you sign in from your home machine? Did you sign in? And to your exact point, if you start adding in Azure AD, conditional access policies, which I'm sure we're going to find in this guide that say you must be in Intune, you must be compliant, having a very decent compliance basis that covers a lot of the things you need to cover, then you're right. You tighten that net of what the threat actor has to do to jump through those hoops, right? Even if they have access to a username and password, in order to access more and more sensitive things, like you could say maybe my RMM or my PSA or things that are very valuable to me, or in the end user's concerns, their EMR, other things that might hold PII, PHI, then you start getting into an understanding that you're really restricting what's going to be in that asset list. Well, I don't want to take away from this. We do have some comments, so I'm going to go ahead and use this in here. So it looks like Dan Brinkman, I may be wrong if that's not Dan, said, hey, has anybody found Microsoft Compliance Manager useful in reporting, tracking compliance against a framework such as CIS? I'll tackle that real quick before I post the responses, and then I'll let you as well, Nick. Don't forget, Microsoft Compliance Manager, even for reporting and tracking that compliance, in order that, at least check the box, the system's there, I have a conditional access policy in place, it does ask for MFA, it does ask for these things, is still not the full breadth of where data might be. You go back to that picture, unless you're in that perfect world I talked about where everything's under Azure Information Protection, everything's encrypted, you have data labels that give you what data sensitivity, you've codified your single sign-on systems with different sensitivities based on the data that's there, and all those things are behind that same identity plane, both device and user identity plane, then there's still more to it than just what you're going to track in the Microsoft Center. That said, I've met with certain MSPs that have taken their client down that path, and in their case, I think the work that's being done in that tracking is still flawed. God bless Microsoft's heart. But go ahead, Nick. What are your thoughts on it?
No, I agree. I have actually this as a recommendation to review this in the purview section of this guide. But I think that ultimately, just like SecuriScore, when we talk about the security or defender side of the house, it largely is looking at a certain lens as well too that doesn't necessarily meet the licensing you have intended in some cases that I've seen in the past. Sure. But it also is not looking at the lens of your customer's environment and kind of evaluating those things. So I think it's good to evaluate maybe track against certain frameworks, those types of things. But in a lot of cases, what they recommend and what they're getting into is either licensing that isn't going to be part of SMB, or it's features that as an MSP are heavily under adopted, like information labels, protection labels, some of the higher level compliance settings, like even DLP policies, I think
Sure.
are, something that is well under adopted, but they're also kind of buggy, right? Like
Right.
I've seen
Right.
a lot of that too. So, you have your catch 22 with that as well too. So I do recommend reviewing it, just in a general sense, because it's good to get that holistic picture. But actioning off of it is kind of a different story. And that's where I fold it back to this, because it's more of a holistic picture, across the board for what I
Yeah.
feel like an MSP could accomplish, or a small business in that sense.
Well, and I would still track those compliances in some form of a GRC, whatever that might be, whether it be Excel sheets or whether that be some other methodology. But ultimately, I would say you would add to that, and I agree with you on that. I've got a couple other comments to run through real quick. Dan Brinkman was replied to by LinkedIn user with appropriate privacy settings. Said, I've not yet, but that is something I would like to leverage as I dive deeper. Mickey Pruitt actually pops in and goes, how have I never seen Beard Banter? What's up, Mickey? Yeah, it's been around a minute, and it's because I suck at being on a cadence is the answer to that question, because of my travel. So it happens when it happens. So couple people said, oh yeah, Mark's backing up kind of what I said. Right now I found it less useful than an Excel sheet. In fact, to add back to usefulness though, I think, Nick, was I've seen a lot of the work that Microsoft's doing on the baselines in Lighthouse, baseline capabilities. And I think a lot of that is where I would apply what you've build my baselines against these for my customers, and then check to see if those are actually set to be able to do a state of the union for that customer more and more, right? Like that's the way I would see this, as operational work through of that. What are your thoughts on that, Ross, while I look at some of these other comments?
No, you're good. Yeah, I agree. I think this is a good starting point to get a holistic picture, take an inventory, perform a gap analysis on where your customers are about today. But then you can have much more targeted conversations with your customers as well too, about the risk involved with each one of these. One thing I'm actually doing as part of a newer version with this as well too is mapping all of these to the MITRE framework and techniques, just so there's a
Woo.
clear picture of this is what could happen, with this hole that you have opened up in your ecosystem. And that just is kind of like, this is real life evidence, right? That this is actually a risk. And then that's a better conversation to have about their own risk tolerance,
Yeah.
especially relates to, when we talk about a customer that's kind of on the fence about buying more premium licensing with Microsoft, like Business Premium versus going with Standard. It's, to me, it's a non-negotiable. Like your risk tolerance should never be that low. And sure, you could bolt on third-party options, but in my mind, like you want that to be able to cover all these holes, especially just in the Microsoft ecosystem, and that only extend out. But
Yeah.
the risk tolerance conversation gets easier and easier when you have real life evidence of, these are, it's basically like I did a pen test on your environment, and these are the things that, are you're heavily exposed with. Are you comfortable with this kind of risk right now?
Right. When you bring up a good point about what's interesting about pure cloud, when you talk about going to Azure AD or Okta, I don't want to be specific, but Microsoft's obviously is the one you and I both specialize in the most. But when you think about managing that, it's really hard to call that a pen test anymore. It's really hard to call it that. It's really much better to call it, and I think it was Heath Adams that said this from TCM Security, is do we not call this a cloud configuration check, right? At the end of the day, you're starting to get into, once we know what these settings are and what they do, and I think to your point of tying it back to MITRE and the MITRE TTPs or techniques that are there, the MITRE techniques you can see that are mapped, is a brilliant way of thinking about it. I do believe probably a lot of that work's already done, certainly in the sense that when CIS allows a safeguard to be on CIS, it has to have a pre-existing attack that it would have stopped, from Phyllis Lee's words that she said on my show. And so I think that you're going to find there's a very easy corollary for that, and it's very valuable. Yeah, for sure. When you talk about like identity takeovers, token takeovers, start talking about token session lifetimes, things like that. And is there any of that in here? Actually, I would wager session lifetimes, things like that.
There is, yeah, in the Entra section, more related to conditional access. But you're right. I mean, even on the MITRE website, if you go there, they have a cloud section, and Microsoft, or what they saw as Office 365, is on there, where they're mapping a lot today. Some of it's going to be really redundant. I have probably, I don't know, like over 110 controls on this list or something like that between all of those different services. But some of it will be redundant, right? Like a lot of what you're doing with conditional access might be, preventing that initial access, right, or reconnaissance or something like that as well too. While Security awareness training relates, under the phishing section, those types of things as well too. So there is pretty good evidence there. I just want people to have some ammo, when you go to those conversations with customers about, hey, this is a list of the attacks, that have happened because of this, this potential vulnerability that you have in your environment. This is why we want to implement this. This is what it's going to impact, like for your users. But this is how we want to roll it out. And that's always how I encourage it, because you can do proper pilot testing. You can get stakeholder buy-in that way. You can get better feedback on how to refine that, because every customer is different, and I think we all know that they hate change. Like I hate change.
No, blowing my mind right now, Nick Ross.
But yeah, it's any little things like that can be they can either really help your reputation, right, or they can really hurt it. And I just like to be very, very tactical when it comes to these types of things, for sure.
Couple things I'd like to do. Number one is I'd love to help you when you go through your MITRE attack mapping, and when you go through attack framework mapping. And two, I also have one suggestion right now that I can help you with. Now, if you remember when we were dealing with each other from the PAX8, and I was a customer at the time of PAX8, I always used to joke that I had these one-string guitars, right? And then my number one-string guitar was SSO. I would play it every time. SSO, like every time. And one of the things I think you've actually touched on here, but also missed an opportunity here, and that's why I'd like to also help with some of your mapping, is this one about SCIM provisioning. When you think about SCIM provisioning, it's an addition to SSO. And just for everybody that's out there, SCIM provisioning allows you to take at the identity provider, so the Microsoft Azure ID, AD, or Intra ID aspect of it, and then extend those groups, copy those groups and group memberships and things about that user information out to the actual consuming party, the service provider, right? So your SaaS vendor, your Dropboxes, your EMR on the web type services, whatever it may be. And so it's consuming those things. So what you've missed, I think, in my opinion, Nick, is yes, your 5.6 and centralizing account management, but that's already part of SSO. SCIM really brings 6.7, which is centralizing access control, meaning that I can then tie groups that I've skimmed over from this base into the application and make a more granular access control that says inside there, this group is the admins for the law department. This one is just the consumers. This is the receptionists. And now I'm centralizing the access control back to something in Intra or in Microsoft Azure AD, being able to then extend that. So I think there's a 6.7 warranted here, and some explanation on that as well when you're starting to talk about SCIM vis-a-vis that. So
yeah.
Any thoughts on that? Or Matt, you're an idiot. I'm fine with either. It works for me.
No, I think it's funny because like I have them in the inverse that you just mentioned, right? Like, so for 6.7, I have single sign-on. So I don't disagree with you. I think that while we're taking a look at that, you do have, like SSO to me trumps SCIM, right? That's kind of like the
Yeah. That's why it's 5.6. That's the account management being centralized.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. In that case, I agree with you, because I do think that, in that situation, while it's hard to do because of SSO tax, right, and those types of things, and configuration, like it's very hard to get to a state where you have your core application set up because of those things. You're talking about tripling, quadrupling your cost, and your companies just aren't going to do that just for being able to leverage their Microsoft credentials and not seeing the whole security picture behind that. But outside of that, I think, when we take a look at our customers that are using SCIM provisioning, it's just such a smoother process, for access controls. When we talk about onboarding and offboarding checklist, even security aside.
Now it's disable an account, it's all disabled. And with SCIM, it's disabled and disabled inside the service in some form or fashion, or follow some rules. So.
When it's set up right in those senses, I think Nathan Taylor described it to me this way, but I agree. It's like, it's a very elegant solution. Right? You feel very accomplished when you get to that stage.
True story.
So,
and it's actually quite scalable, right? In that same regard. All right, got to get a couple comments because people are super happy. First person that's happy is saying, I'm happy to see that Matt Lee talks to people that don't only have a beard. Nick Ross owning the clean cut look. True story. So thank you. And then this one, the guide Nick Ross published is legit. I agree. It is amazing. This is pretty bad. A star. I can't believe they typed star, but good for them. 90s, it's probably. Anyways, amazing and great job. And then I think Ian with Simeon Cloud going to publish their CIS baseline soon. Shameless plug, but good. I love them too, so that's fair. And then also question, if purchased, does it come with an annual updates or renewals or just a one-time deal? Ross, I think that's probably targeted for you if you're selling that.
Yeah, completely provide updates. It's not just a one-time purchase. I just sent out 2.0 to everybody last month, so all updated there. And from the Simeon front, I did work with Simeon directly to incorporate a lot of these policies into their baseline and help them with that from a coding perspective. So I know they're going to be coming out with that soon, but fan of that tool as well too, just from a DSC perspective. Being like we talked about earlier, automation is security. That's cool. That really helps with that.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to touch on real quick, just to not miss this point, Nick, was I think that 5.6 and 6.7 can be accomplished without SCIM. And what I mean by that is, think about me setting up these SSO groups for each of these applications. I could say that my access control is only granular to yes or no, you have access to the application in my centralized access control by putting you in the group or not in the group to access an application. So I would agree that 5.6 is the centralization of accounts. That's SSO. And 6.7 is also SSO vis-a-vis doing the work to actually granulate on what people have access to. I believe SCIM simply brings a deeper ability to bring that group membership. Let's say that Nick has a title of VP of product, then he should get VP of producty type rights places. Right. And so now I can have a group that automatically takes your title, puts you in a dynamic group. That dynamic group puts you in the group for that particular software you're supposed to have access to. And therefore, now that group also gives you your role inside that software. Right. Because now I can say, not only do you have access to Marketo, but you have access to it with this capability inside there. Right. And so just to really clarify my point on that 5.6 to 6.7 correlation in my mind. So,
yeah,
and where this
I would agree with that. Even thinking about that progression, I think dynamic groups is even trumping, SSO to a certain degree, right? Because you're then navigating access controls dynamically and without human intervention. So it's another great avenue to start with. Especially with the SSO limitations that we talked of as well too.
This is desired state configuration question. Somebody saying, anybody on this call deployed Microsoft's DSC or desired state configuration in Azure DevOps? According to this guide, if you have, I have blank. So I have blank for your time. Oh, money for your time. Fair. Okay, cool. So somebody's asking if you've done that. Have you played around with this at all? I have not.
I have built it. And myself and a very sophisticated colleague, Ken, at a previous MSP I worked for, spent over 8 hours trying to configure it. We're pretty savvy, so it just is time consuming. So I understand the money
the time money. I think you need to add 3 more dollar signs to that per hour rate in your mind. This is what might have to happen in this particular situation. Is your point?
Yeah,
that's fair.
It's you're spinning up VMs, you're deploying certs, like you're doing a lot, to get things spun up with that. And is the juice worth the squeeze? If you get that much time spent into it, it's lower maintenance, but it is a lot of there's a big knowledge gap, and you're learning new tools, most likely like Azure DevOps too. So it's a hurdle.
Yeah, fair. And I get where desired state configuration comes from. It's really just that instead of me making a script to do something and another script to check for something, I just want it to be something, right? Is essentially this DSC configuration desire, right? Am I overstating or understating that, Nick?
Yeah, you're good. Yep.
Okay. So we were actually Johnny foreshadowing, because you do get into 2.8, dynamic groups are leveraged for automated group membership. And so one of the things that we were talking about just a minute ago was having that ability to automatically and dynamically place someone in a group. And so you are giving some of that guidance in this particular case. And some of the things that I liked about this was like saying, hey, such as job roles, locations that automatically determine membership. This ensures that users have a timely access to resources they need and are immediately removed when their status changes, minimizing the risk of outdated permissions. What you're dealing with is scope creep or permission creep, right? You're dealing with this fact that at some point, Matt used to be on Team Alpha in Dallas working with the Team Alpha clients, which is 30 or so clients. And then Matt decided to move to Team Bravo because he had an issue with this one person, let's say. I know it's hard to believe I'd ever have an issue with someone that blows my mind, but yeah, I don't usually. Actually, I love people. But the point being, it moves to Team Bravo. Well, at some point they give me access to Team Bravo because I complained I didn't have access to Team Bravo. But did anybody trim Team Alpha? What if my title was Team Alpha, sysadmin 1, and it changed to Team Bravo sysadmin 1? I would be removed from one dynamic group and I would be placed upon another dynamic group, right? Like, is that kind of the context here, Nick?
Yeah. It's one, again, automating access controls, because really you should try to build everything around that membership when we talk about access to data, whether that's Teams, SharePoint, but in addition to that, you talked about SSO applications, so access controls really get extended quite greatly. And it's not it's not as easy as it sounds, right? I think it's easy to say, oh, you just put in these attributes and they all sync up, but you go through any growth whatsoever at your company, that's going to shift and evolve, and you have to constantly kind of reevaluate it. And when you start getting into hard coding users into dynamic groups, that's when you're doing it wrong, in that sense. I've been part of that as well too in those conversations. So it's hard because you're just like, I don't know what to do with this user, but they need to be in this group. So that's where it's like, hey, can I take a step back and really take a bigger look at the picture here.
And don't forget that when you're dealing with 6.1 and CIS, which is what this codifies to, when you're dealing with 6.1, even in Microsoft, you could have multiple versions. Great example. Let's say everybody has a marketing department and people need to be in marketing, and I'm going to have a dynamic user title. It puts me in a group for the marketing content at the level I need to be at. Great. But you also might have teams, groups of people working together to accomplish a goal, tiger teams, things that pop up that just need to get worked. And so understand you might have role-based access control or something to this nature, right? Attribute-based access control. But you might also kick in a discretionary access control. The owner of that team is going to be the one to determine Nick Ross should be here and should not be here. And so when you see Nick calling out that this is tying to a safeguard, it's not fully satisfying that safeguard. It's simply explaining more of how this correlates to the things and activities you should be doing in your world to meet these safeguards and overlying controls. And so just always take it with a grain of salt that when this is saying 6.1, don't say 6.1 solved. 6.1 has to be a process. It's probably going to run outside of this. It may reference this setting. It may reference a procedure whereby this setting is set. It may reference a procedure whereby you define what people have access to. But ultimately, it needs to be a process outside of this. And so anytime you see a .1, there's a couple of controls that violate this. I think 9 is one of them. But they're usually going to be a process. It's usually going to be something you need to have in a document or in a GRC or in a process management platform of some form that's going to be the policy, then tied to those underlying procedure and policy and process documents. And this would be some of those settings called out for in those process documents, right? And in those procedure documents. And if you're doing it really well, or to Nick Ross's, you're not doing it wrong process, it's automated. You're using something like a Roost or some kind of, your self-automation tool. In fact, maybe I touch on that. What are your thoughts on automating the automation of this, right? And automating the rollout and onboarding of this in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you want to have, number one, consistency, right? I think you want to make sure that there's not going to be human error involved, but I also think that there's always change, right? There's new features introduced, there's new things that you can do from the security front, and everybody's in different maturity levels. So whenever we have the chance to automate certain processes like that, for configuration, for tenant onboardings, for looking at, moving them up in maturity levels, change control in general, that's always something that's going to come up, from the standpoint of how can we simplify our lives, around this and those types of things. So, tools like Roost, tools like Simian, those kinds of players in the space to really layer on additional automation behind that to help kind of enforce these controls. But like you mentioned, it is not saying 6.1's good. It's just saying that we kind of scope this a little bit so that it's giving a lot better protection. But we need to still be diligent, soon breach mentality, those types of things as well.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to call out in this that you brought up with your guide is you also have a easier to consume breakdown of this in an Excel format too, right? So I'm going to go ahead and share that as well, and we can kind of chat about it and just help me understand. So how's this constructed? Is this almost one for one the same way, or have you remapped it in some form? Help me understand what this is.
This is just a different way to consume it, really. I got a lot of people after 1.0 kind of reach out and say, I'd rather see this because I just had it mapped to the individual suite offerings like Entra and things like that.
Sure.
And they said, hey, I'd rather see this mapped, one-to-one with the CIS controls if it's applicable, in that way. So it's just a different lens at the end of the day to say that, maybe multiple controls are hitting the CIS safeguard. And it kind of goes through, licensing IG1 through IG3, and then also any notes, those types of things as well too. And I leave it open so that what a lot of people have done that have consumed this is also just mapped it to their customer to put in notes about, is there a justification reason why this isn't done? Where are we at in this? Have we completed it? More of a checklist, if you will, for those things. So same material really at the end of the day, just in a different format.
Sure. And then now it becomes filterable, right? Because I can say, get rid of IG1s. I just want to focus on IG2, which is now going to show me all of IG2, but not IG3, right? Or show me IG3s, and that'll show me all of them, 1, 2, and 3, right, in that same format. So you could actually do some filtering on that. And I think some of the things that you're getting into are actually some of the gaps for the differences in like CIS and how it's written and where the modern network goes. So what I mean by that is, if you think about CIS, it's very focused on a traditional network infrastructure, even going so far as to call out 1.4, connect DHCP logs. Yeah, Matt. No, this is Matt. I'm with Sourcepass. Sure. Yes, I know. No, I don't want a coffee. I need you to get me your DHCP logs. 3 of my employees were there for a coffee lunch meeting today, and I need right. No, that's not realistic. And so you're starting to actually get down to the root of it, which is gain something about this active asset identity, right? What is this asset? And when you talk about what is a network, that's shifting, right? Even Phyllis says a network is ends where your users' fingertips land, and so you start having to show that you're kind of having to take a approach to it from a modern perspective and fit it into a lens that's not perfectly aligned with this, right? Like a great example of you mapped 1.5, Azure AD audit logs are periodically reviewed as a passive asset discovery tool. Sure, I agree, right? What about this active asset discovery tool? When you talk about 1.3, Intune is an active asset discovery tool. In their mind, they really, really mean something like a probe, right? They really, really mean something that is actively sending packets, waiting for an asset to respond because it had an ARP address, an ARP entry, and saying, yes, I now know what this thing is because it responded and it had this kind of a flavor to it, right? And so that's the difference of now you're saying, no. I want you to reimagine. This is active because it's a list. And if someone signs in, it's going to be listed here. And it is now actually tighter to what is a network, which is things touching my data. And so was that a bit of a struggle as you were looking at some of these maps and going, well, how doesn't it 1.4 even apply in this world, right? Like,
no doubt. Like, I mean, there's a lot of what I consider to be very legacy environments when you talk about those types of things like DHCP. I just was like, we're not even going to look at that with Microsoft's ecosystem, those types of things. But it definitely required perceiving things as they exist today, being modern, looking at zero trust architecture, the things that we do when we're talking about risk at the identity, at the device, at the data layer, versus our perimeter, our firewall, people getting into our network that way. It's totally, in my opinion, it's gone because we're working hybrid, we're working remote. Like there's breakdowns there, and even certain legacy things like I think VPNs are even getting more legacy with some of the newer technology Microsoft's coming out with, like global access, where you can create your own private and virtual networks, directly and tie those back to conditional access policies. So there's some really cool changes, and I really wanted to highlight those just because there is a way that you can maintain a high level of security and also give users more flexibility as well too, and that transcends down to not only better security but hopefully a better customer experience at the end of the day too.
Yeah, that's been my experience. In fact, is if I gave any advice to CIS as they get their working group together for the people making the next iteration that comes out, is to ensure that we're thinking about things from 2 lenses. And what's interesting about that is you have this chasm forming in my mind. And it's part of the book that Juan Fernandez and myself and Wes Spencer and Marnie Stockman all wrote. And just to say, Marnie was the brains of the operation. We were just there to look pretty. But at the end of the day, when we talked about this, we said, you have this world divided where if I started a company tomorrow, there's almost zero chance I have a server. There's almost zero chance I have traditional brownfield operations defined. Right? It's much more specific that I'm going to be identity centric, extending into SaaS, using those platform services, kind of as we talked about. But you have all these companies that are born the other way. In fact, 90% of your client base, probably even still in most cases, is going to be the legacy infrastructure, traditional AD, living with some line of business application or maybe even none. And they've moved to cloud, but they haven't gotten rid of their identity plane being on AD. And so you have this very like brownfield operation side of things. And so as you look at CIS, you almost could write a guide that says, hey, listen, if you're in this modern world, here's what it looks like. If you're in this legacy world, this stuff still applies in the same way. And a great example I would give is if I land in an Active Directory environment that's being synced to the cloud to create their cloud identities, then I have probably the largest attack surface in front of me to be able to attack that cloud surface. My protect surface is larger because of that local systems. I can do curb roasting. I can do LLM&R poisoning. I can do all kinds of things and find all kinds of ways and misconfigurations to wind up domain admin. To do the same thing against the cloud, it comes back to Nick Ross's baselines. It's whether or not those things are set and checked at this point. And some of those are quite automatable and some of those are quite scriptable and even being easier to do with Microsoft, with Lighthouse, things like that. And so my point is that I would probably not be in this brownfield world. I would be in a greenfield world. And if I am, so many more of these things apply in a modern sense and in a way that's very scalable. And the others would mean you're still going to have to do those things. I'm still going to be able to be IoT attacked by the toaster that can then gain a foothold into the Active Directory controller that then gives me domain admin that lets me sync that username and password to the cloud, that gives me the access to the cloud, that lets me then do the same ponage from the cloud, right? And so you kind of get into this world where we're starting to see a gap of this have and have nots. And the more and more you're in the have side of that, the more of this stuff applies one-to-one, doesn't it? And I think you're probably living this way at this point. Have you guys gotten to this stage? Dare I ask without asking prep ahead of time, but are you guys Azure AD only and tied that way, or still kind of live in both worlds?
Still kind of live in both worlds. It's one of the heavier initiatives that, I really am pushing forward now too. It's just in the general sense of one thing that I think, in looking at some of the experiences or some other MSPs like, Summit Technology that I worked for previously, we were managing a great amount of clients and only had around 2 service technicians because everybody was in the cloud, and we were able to
scalable
thing, and it was not only secure, but it was just low overhead. The same is true at Machine Logic, who we acquired a couple of months ago. 95% of their customers were fully modern, and it's just a different experience. It's not just secure, but it's obviously just less headaches for everybody as well too. At the end of the day, from all the configuration that you have to do, things going into live support, those types of things as well. But you're exactly spot on. I mean, there's a wide range of attack vectors that you then have to extend even further, take up more of your time, and those types of things. And it's not an easy conversation to have, right? It takes a lot of convincing in some cases. In other cases, you're looking at CapEx versus OpEx for people, and that's just a different game as well too. So there's a lot to consider. I'm not saying it's easy by any means, but it should be a motivator for everybody to reduce that. And also comes back to that risk tolerance conversation about, do you realize like there's all this going on, and I don't know how long we can actually support protecting it based off of things into life and those types of things too.
Yeah. And what's interesting is I think the MSPs that'll be the most successful are the ones that can help guide their clients through that change. And the reason that is that their competitor is starting up today. Their competitor is starting without that brownfield opportunity, which means that the people that have it, the momentum and the business, do not have the technology, the flexibility, the speed, the other pieces that they need, right? I did a really cool speech with Juan Fernandez about the book, and I just started it. Have you ever seen How Not to Land an Orbital Rover? It was by SpaceX. It was the one where they actually show it blowing up 100 times, right? Like they just show every time they tried to land it and it blew up. And they ultimately finally landed it, right? And my advocation is it's those companies that fail the fastest for the cheapest and move quicker and iterate through that the best and the most flexibly that will beat the others, right? That's who wins. He or she who can move and fail the fastest wins. And at the end of the day, I think that's what being cloud native actually does help drive for you. I don't know who posted this one, but I'll go ahead and show it. It'll also be in the comments. But cloud native for the win. But the reality is not all customers are there. Exactly. This new intro feature is a big deal for us, and we will build on this to better manage and automate hybrid environments. And they're talking about whatever that feature is. Let me see if I can read it. Entra AD blog using flexible way of bringing identities from any. Yeah, multiple identity tracking. Sure. Very cool. Have you played around with that at all yet? I have not.
I'm trying to open that link. I assume it's like it's basically like skim provisioning for anything, right?
Well, they're saying Azure AD Blog introducing a new flexible way of bringing identities from any. And so I'm assuming this is some feature that brings it all into Entra for purview, essentially.
Yeah, I did a POC with that. John Savell, if you're familiar with him on YouTube, has a really great video demoing that. But it's basically like, Azure has, or Entra now has only a couple of HR platforms that you can integrate with deeply from skim provisioning from that side, because we think about lifecycle comes from HR, goes to Active Directory and all that. But this is basically giving you an open API for a skim object to push over from any HR provider into Entra, so that you could really automate the whole process of onboarding from a user. Obviously too. So it's pretty powerful.
That solves a problem. So one of the things that I was at a conference last year that some major CEOs at large corporations were talking about was how they had failed a compliance because they had said that they would move you out of your HR platform into ours, during an acquisition, and we couldn't because they were tied to that HR platform for their ID. That was their identity provider, IDP. So it almost sounds like what they're creating is a copy and import of those identities, but the identity provider remains Microsoft, which means if you were to strip one away, you could theoretically have that one also be one that then matches up. And so you're maintaining your IDP as Microsoft, but feeding it with information about those data points from an HR system. Is that fair to say, Nick?
Yep. Yeah, you're just sending a skim object from the HR provider that has customizable attributes that you can map to AD attributes, and you're provisioning that user. You're updating their job title, department, whenever something in the HR system. And it's not just like a third-party HR. It could be a CSV file. It could be a database, that you just have locally, those types of things. But it's just an open endpoint that you can send a skim package to, which is really cool. And
it is really cool.
Why companies like not to rip on Rippling, but that's a company that tries to be an IDP that is really not. Like they shouldn't be, because you're sacrificing all the security, when you talk about that, versus I'm always going to rely on somebody like Microsoft for that, from my identity perspective, versus a third party. That's a lot lower.
Yeah. Well, listen, as it usually does on Beard Banter, this 45 minutes flew by like it was nothing, and we're not even barely scraping the surface of this tool. I'd leave you with, I just wanted to have this conversation because I wanted to highlight the awesome work you're doing on this, and a lot. I'll post it. It's fine. That's fair. That's fair. And with some anonymity, which is even better, right? So thank you, privacy settings. But anyways, I guess I'll wrap it up with that. Blank Rippling. No, that's not the summation of the show. But I do appreciate the work you're doing. If you haven't seen this guide, it's fantastic. It is getting worked with CIS as far as becoming part of that baseline potentially. Microsoft's trying to answer this question. CIS is trying to answer these questions. Looks like Nick Ross is answering those questions. And it's just awesome to get to work with you and be in the same space trying to secure the world, man. So thank you for all you do. Anybody else, check out Nick Ross. If you haven't followed him, you definitely need to. He's a baller. And follow T-Minus365 if you want to get those quick videos that, even though they were quick for you, they took him an hour and 40 minutes to prep and set up and do his whiteboarding and all of that just for that 3 minutes of content. But appreciate all you do, brother. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited. So feel free to reach out and hit me up on LinkedIn, guys, or anywhere. So
see y'all.
Yeah.